Hello everyone and welcome to the review of the Bahrain Grand Prix, which was of course won by Oscar Piastri, who put together a dominant performance to take pole position and then the race win, basically leading every lap. Let's start at the beginning. This all happened once again on Saturday, where Oscar was able to put together a great lap to take pole position ahead of George Russell, whilst his teammate Lando Norris only qualified down in 6th after making a mistake on his final Q3 lap. Going to the start of the race then, most drivers decided to start on the soft tyre. However, the Ferraris went with the mediums, trying to run a little bit longer in that first stint, which they ultimately did end up doing. But the soft tyre, I think, was the tyre to start on, which most people ended up going with. Piastri held the lead into turn 1 with a good getaway, whilst Lando Norris made up a bunch of positions at the start of the race. However, this was all to come undone when it was found out he had jumped the start, or well, technically it actually moved forward ahead of his grid box when he put the car into first gear. I think he was trying to find the clutch bite point, is what they were saying on the commentary. The car rolled forward out of the pit box, and that was why he was given a 5-second penalty, which he served at his first pit stop. Antonelli put together some great overtakes in this first section of the race after starting a bit lower down than most of the other front runners, and it was really interesting to watch, and we got to see the Ferraris try and use those medium tyres to attack the soft runners at the end of the stint. We then had the first of the front runners being Max and Lando pitting on lap 11 here, which was then followed by Russell on lap 14, and Piastri was around the same time here. This was when they were first able to get some gaps in the traffic to be able to pit back into. Max came out behind Lando and Russell came out ahead of Lando. So Max just didn't have the car pace really. He was dropping back from the leaders at the beginning of the stint, and of course Lando couldn't get the undercut given he had to serve his 5-second penalty, and Piastri came back out in the lead. The Ferraris decided to run longer at this stage to build a tyre offset and hopefully enable them to do some overtaking at the end of the race. Unfortunately, I just don't think they really had the pace. The tyre offset helped them catch up to the cars they needed to pass, but they couldn't get past Lando Norris, George Russell, those types of drivers. The tyre offset just wasn't big enough for that to happen. Antonelli then put a great pass on Max Verstappen during this stage as well, showing his skills, as Max was complaining with the balance of his car and he was being incredibly unhappy with it. And to be fair, the Red Bull did look pretty bad. You then had Yuki and Sainz coming together at turn 1, where Yuki got a bit of oversteer on the inside of the corner and kind of ran wide into Carlos, which damaged the side of his car quite significantly at this stage. And then they decided to deploy the safety car to clear up the debris, which was at turn 1, which I think was the right choice to make. The cars were pretty spread out, so I don't think a VSC would have enabled a safe condition for the track workers to get onto the basically near the racing line and pick up the debris. So the safety car enabled to pack the bunch up and meant it was safe for those safety workers to go onto the track marshals, and pick up the debris. And this was an interesting point here because we got a lot of diversion in strategy at this stage. You had George Russell. He went with the soft tyre, same with Kimi Antonelli. The McLarens both went with the medium tyre, whilst the Ferraris went with the hard tyre. So you had a big kind of diversion in strategy, and it was going to be interesting to see how it played out towards the end of the race, given there was 22 laps. I think the medium in the moment looked like the right choice. The hard tyre didn't look great, and the soft tyre I thought wouldn't really last for 24 laps given the high degradation, especially on the rear tyres around Bahrain. We then had a couple incidents further down the track. Sainz and Antonelli came together, for which Sainz was then given a 10-second penalty for, which he then served before he retired the car. There was some confusion because the steward said he would have a grid drop for Saudi Arabia coming up, but they didn't realize he had already served his penalty. So Sainz served the 10-second penalty and won't have a grid drop coming up for Saudi Arabia. Liam Lawson also got himself in a bit of trouble with 2 10-second penalties for incidents, which is very unfortunate. I don't think it affected his race that much. He wasn't in the fight for the points positions. The RBs or Racing Bulls just really weren't that quick this weekend in the race pace at least, so I don't think it ruined his race too much at all. George Russell then seemed to really be struggling with his car, but not from the actual car's performance. The car mechanically seemed to be falling a bit apart as random buttons were coming on. He was struggling to use the right buttons at the right stages, and he said he pressed the radio button and the DRS came on at one stage, which he was investigated for. However, the stewards decided that he gained only a 0.13 second advantage, and then he lifted off extra in the next corner and lost 0.26 seconds. It wasn't a deliberate thing. He hit the radio button and the DRS came on because he had to manually use the DRS at this stage because the systems in the car just weren't working at all, which was very unfortunate for him. But fortunately, he wasn't penalized, which I think was the right decision. He lost time because he decided to give up that 0.26 of a second, and this just wasn't his fault at all. He basically was doing nothing to deliberately try and gain an advantage. So I was happy with the steward's decision in this moment. Lando was then on the offensive for the final bit of this race, trying to get past George Russell and Charles Leclerc. Ultimately, he couldn't get past Russell. He tried it on the final lap going down into turn 1 around the outside, but Russell just closed the door and basically said, "You're not going around the outside of me today, Lando," which I think was fair racing. Lando really wasn't far enough alongside to demand the space, and they had a joke about it in the cool-down room, so no hard feelings there at all. But it was a really dominant victory for Oscar Piastri. He basically led every lap where he could have. Obviously, the Ferraris ran longer, so Charles led some laps, but Piastri was in a completely good vein of form today. He was managing his tyres. He wasn't pushing too hard. He was just driving as slow as he could in order to win the race, which is what Alan Prost said you should be doing. So it was a great drive from Piastri and a great qualifying performance as well. We also had strong results for other drivers and teams. Haas got another double points finish with Behrman in 10th, and I believe Ocon was in 8th, so a great job from them. And then Gasly also had a great drive. I believe he finished in 7th. Solid drive, great qualifying from Gasly, and he really extracted the most out of that Alpine. I will quickly touch on some issues there were with the broadcast. I am Australian, so I get the Sky broadcast, and there was issues with the timing tower, so I'm not sure if this was an every broadcast thing, but when you're paying that amount to watch the races, it was because George's transponder wasn't working. They got rid of the entire timing tower, which I think was unnecessary. Just keep the timing tower then and explain that George Russell's transponder isn't working as it should be, instead of removing the entire timing tower, because then it's much more difficult for us to keep up with the race and keep up with the gaps. I did appreciate that they did like an end of lap type gap, but just keep the timing tower up and explain that George Russell's position is not correct. I think that would have been the best decision. But yeah, lots of technical difficulties in Bahrain this week with George's car and of course the broadcast. But overall, I much preferred this race to Japan last week. Bahrain usually delivers because there's high tire wear, which means you will get offsets in pace between the different cars, so you can get overtaking. And overall, I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. Really solid race. We didn't really have a battle for the lead, but that's because Piastri drove a great race, so I can only applaud him for that. But we did get much more interesting strategy battles this week with variations in tires, and you saw that at the final safety car, where you had 3 different tire compounds being used by the top 3 different manufacturers at this stage. I'll quickly touch on Red Bull here. As I mentioned earlier, Verstappen didn't really have a great weekend. He couldn't pull off the heroics he managed to do in Japan last week. The Red Bull just looked like a bad car to drive. It took him until the final lap to get past Gasly's Alpine, which just showed how slow that Red Bull was. Tsunoda did a great job, I think, to finish in the points today and get his first points for Red Bull. Very solid job from them. They'll be looking to rebound back in Saudi Arabia next week. It's a bit more similar to Japan, so they might have a bit more performance, but we'll just have to wait and see. We've got the final race of the triple header coming up this week at the Jeddah Corniche International Circuit, which is one of my favorite circuits on the current Formula One calendar. Sector 1 is great. It's a high-speed street circuit. You can overtake there if you got enough of an advantage, and I think it's really cool just seeing the cars fly through that Sector 1 and the speed they can carry through all those high-speed corners. I love it, and I'm very excited, but thank you so much for tuning in, guys, and let me know what you would rate the race out of 10 down below.